discussion. And it is my pleasure to hand things over to my coworker, Mercy Counselor, Mrs. Holly Bennett, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Hogan, our guest for this evening. Dr. Hogan has been married for 31 years and has 3 adult children. Personally, I have had the opportunity to get to know Dr. Hogan when I worked with his son and his family, Brendan, when I worked at U of D Jesuit. And from the first time I met Dr. Hogan, I became a fan. He's got great insights, and I really appreciate what he has offered the counseling world as a whole. Dr. Hogan is the former director at Grace Counseling Center on the east side of Detroit, where he led a team of 12 therapists in an underserved part of the city for 12 years. He consults and has contributed to the Family Life series for RCLB, a Catholic publisher. Additionally, Dr. Hogan teaches at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. I've always enjoyed his insights, and I'm truly honored and excited to welcome Dr. Tim Hogan to our community this evening. Without further delay, Dr. Tim Hogan.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. This is a real gift to get to be with you. And I tell you, this all started when I had a chance to be with your counseling team and your administrative team, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago. And I heard their hearts were kind of aching and breaking for parents and families, knowing just how many losses you're all suffering through. Now, I know they're working harder than anyone I know to try and find ways to make it not as bad, but I know they're aware that there's a lot of loss going on right now. And so they thought, and it really makes sense to me, that we would do this, that we would take some time and look at this as grief, like to understand how is grief one of the core things we are experiencing. And I know you know this, but I think it's really worth talking about, because my experience as I've been doing webinars and talking to people and working with pastors, and I work with a lot of Christian leaders, it's easy to skip the grief part. It's easy to want to go on to coping. But if we don't grieve well, we're going to be in trouble. And I'm going to talk some about that. But you just think about, for all of us as parents, and for those of you that have children in school or, teens at Mercy, all of the things that have been missed this spring. And especially for the senior parents, right? We create, as humans, we're wonderful herd animals, and we create these great rituals, and the rituals are designed to contain all the energy. And this transition into adulthood from high school into college, over the years, we've developed and perfected these rituals that help us to transform and move into this next season. They're so valuable, and we don't think of how valuable they are until a time like this. And now they're missing. And so now we're trying to find our way through this big transformation into adulthood, and we don't have the rituals. And I know there's talk about trying to do them in a different way, but the reality is, there's so many things that they've been looking forward to that they don't have. So we got to start by being really gentle with ourselves. There's an article from the Harvard Business Review, which I think I can get a PDF of and give it to you guys to send out to parents. And it says, that strange feeling you have right now, it's called grief. And that's kind of their take on what's happening to us as we go through this. So this grief that we're going through, though, is pretty difficult to get a handle on. And that is because it's unprecedented, right? Like it's not even like a hurricane or like a natural disaster or an earthquake, because it's not confined to one area. That has no end in sight. So while we're losing experiences, most of us are losing a good chunk of money. We're losing things like 2 weddings in our family, one of which we just decided 2 days ago in August that we're going to let 300 people know that we're not going to be gathering for my daughter's wedding. I mean, these are all losses, and we all have our stories. We all have significant losses, but it's hard to get a real handle on. This is exactly what it's about. The other big thing why this grief is so difficult and why we need to spend this time talking about it is because the normal key to grief is social support. So normally you would say, and we're so good at this, right? Like something bad happens, we all get together, we cram into a church, we light candles, we hold hands, we sing songs, we go eat food, and that's how we grieve. But we can't do that now. So it's a really complicated situation. So here's my hope that by the time we get done today, you're going to have some gentleness and compassion for yourself for why this might be more difficult than you've given yourself permission to feel. And then also some real practical ways to do that grief work. And the reason for that, the big picture reason for that, is because as parents, we need to do this. I think about this with my kids all the time. Something is happening or not happening with our kids. We're talking about this. Mrs. Bennett and I were talking about this about, there's things that her daughter is a freshman. She didn't know. She doesn't even realize what she's missing, but you know what she's missing. And so sometimes grief is harder for us because we get the big picture and we know what a big deal it is. So our grief is different than our kids. If we can take care of our grief first, then we'll do a much better job of taking care of our kids, because that's kind of how this goes, right? As leaders, we kind of set the tone. We kind of define reality. You know, they often say in the, you know, you get on a plane, they say in the unlikely event the cabin pressure changes, right? They say oxygen mask will drop. And, you know, if you're in Ireland, they say, and at that point you should drink your child's whiskey first and then drink your own, because you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of anyone else. And that's really, you know, we just can't give what we don't have. Because if we don't know how to grieve well, and our kids don't know how to grieve well, then a whole bunch of really bad things happen. For example, my wife and I were laughing about this. You know, we normally have like a glass of wine every third night before we go to bed. It's no big deal. We noticed at the end of March that we had stopped buying bottles of wine and had begun buying boxes of wine. And we were going through a box of wine in a week. And then we looked on that box and somehow they tell you there's 4 bottles in that one little box. And so we realized we were drinking every night because we weren't grieving. And so it was just a signal for us, no big deal. We just needed to start talking more about our losses and about what was going on so that we could digest it and not drink to numb it. And that's what we want to teach our kids, right? If they go through a big breakup down the road, this is our chance to show them, this is how you grieve things directly. You look it in the eye, you feel it, you work through it, and then you don't need to do other things to numb it. You can get through it. And as we always say, you know, we leak whatever we're doing. So if we're not grieving well, then all that pain is leaking in some other way. That's probably making us less effective as parents than we want to be. You've probably heard the old adage, you know, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And if we are grieving and not grieving directly, then, you know, everyone's feeling it. I have a favorite quote that I refer to in my own life and often share it with people. And you probably heard it. It says, change is inevitable. Growth is optional. And so one thing we know is going to happen as all of us go through this crazy season of COVID, we know that like in a year and a half, when it's behind us or however long it takes, we're going to be different. We're all going to be different. It's going to have an impact on us. And the question is, are we going to be different in a good way or a not so good way? You know, are we going to be different in that my wife and I are going to be drinking a box and a half of wine every week? Because that would be different, but it wouldn't be better. And so this is our chance to make it better. You know, you probably heard in Wuhan in China, the big news story was once they started opening up again after COVID kind of swept through, divorce attorneys were really busy. That divorces went way up because apparently this, I'm laughing. Because, you know, when you're home with people and you're home with your students, you're probably laughing too, because it's like, okay, that's not a mystery, right? Because people get really stressed, the divorce attorney's open and everyone floods in and says, let's get this over with. But I believe if you look at the research of trauma overall, that's not the full story. You know, if you look at post-Katrina and post-Hugo, what you see is divorces did go up once the offices opened, but so did marriages, so did births of new babies. So the point is, everyone's busy doing something. Everyone's changing. The question is, who's going to change and come out on the other side really better, more free, more loving, more passionate, like really letting go of what doesn't matter. You know, letting go of the stuff that we put our time and attention to that we're finding doesn't matter. And we're going to talk some about that because I think that's what grief does. Grief is like a forest fire and it burns everything. Some really, really good stuff that we just, like weddings and stuff, but it also burns away some stuff that we can kind of say, wow, I guess we didn't need that anyway. We don't need to return to that. So what we want to do is talk about grief. And I'm just going to be real practical. I see grief as happening as a combination of 2 different sets of skills. I think of grief as walking through grief, and you walk through grief on the one hand by facing your pain, letting it affect you, understanding there's a great mystery that when we look pain dead in the eye without flinching, there's a nobility to that changes us in a good direction. It's the core of the Christian faith, but it's also the core of, you know, the Buddhist practices I'm familiar with. It's what dealing with suffering is core. That's the first part. The second part is acting, moving, like not just sitting, but being proactive and empowering in the midst of grief. Because if we just sit still, something terrible kind of happens to our brain and grief turns to trauma and then we're worse off. and then we're drinking 2 boxes of wine a week. So those are the 2 things we're going to do. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about this for about 20, 25 minutes. And then if you have questions, type them in the chat box right now. You don't have to wait till the end. And then if there's something that wasn't clear, or even if it's a practical question, right, about like how they're going to handle something at Mercy, ask that question too. And we'll do our best to get through all of them. So that's the agenda. And that's the why of the agenda. So why don't we take a minute and just acknowledge the presence of God in all of this, and maybe surrender some of it to God as we begin, that through this we wouldn't just learn something with our minds, but maybe we would have a shift inside that would make us more effective, more loving, more healthy. And so we pray, God, for your Spirit to guide our time tonight. Grateful for the parents that sacrifice so much to send their young women to Mercy. We're grateful for that. And we're grateful for the work that you do through Mercy. So many unique things about Mercy, their mission, the way they bless people, their diversity, the way the kingdom is preached there. We thank you for all that. And we pray that through our time tonight, we would get a glimpse of what you're up to in our life, and that you would allow us to grow and heal and become more and more like you. And we pray all this in Christ the Lord. Amen. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is the first part of grief is facing our losses head on and really letting ourselves feel our losses. And as you might guess, this isn't something we like to do, especially when we're in pain. It's a lot easier to just kind of grab our phone and check our Facebook or whatever. Like, we don't like looking at pain. It's kind of funny. A little story. About a year ago right now, actually, I was going through a rough time. I was in the process of leaving Grace, and I had worked with the board for about 7 months to try and get the place to run without me there as the director, and they had decided that wasn't going to happen, and so they had decided to close, which was a huge loss for me, a huge loss. I've been there 24 years. That was the first thing. Then the second thing that happened was my wife, this time last year, was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a pretty serious cancer. It had spread, and so she had 2 surgeries, and they didn't get it all, so they needed to do chemo and then radiation, and we knew we were in for a rough year ahead. So I, as a part of transitioning from the one job to the new office and that, I took a week and went on a silent retreat over at St. Paul of the Cross, which you might know over on 96, Father Pat, who's awesome. And I went in and he said, how do you want to spend your week? And I said, well, I need to solve some problems. I need to figure out what writing projects I'm going to work on. I have a couple different possibilities. I redo my mission statement. I need to redo my values. And I had a whole binder, which I always work from with priorities and all that. And so I said, I'm really excited to do that work this week. And he said, tell me again what's going on in your life. And I told him, about my wife and the ministry. And he said, yeah, we're not going to work on your mission statement this week. I said, what do you mean? And he said, no. He said, I want you to go into the chapel with your journal, and I want you to write about what's going on with your wife, and I want you to write about what's going on with the loss of this ministry, and I want you to write about your feelings, what you've lost, what's hurting about it, what you're going to miss, what's hard about it, if there's any way if you're wondering where God's at in it, if God hasn't come through the way you thought. So just go to the chapel. And so I went with my journal to the chapel. I was on my way there, and he said, wait, and also, Tim, he said, you don't look very good right now. If you need to sleep as much as you want this week, you might need sleep. So anyway, the short version is I went to the chapel and was there for about a half hour of journaling about my losses when I was pretty overcome with pain. And, he said, write in your journal and then look up at the cross, look at Jesus on the cross, which if you've been to St. Paul of the Cross, that's a Passionist cross. So it's got Jesus with his eyes open. So he's kind of looking at you with the whole idea that in the midst of his suffering, there's something redemptive going on. It's kind of cool. So I'm writing, I'm looking at Jesus, I'm writing in my journal. I became aware of so much emotion, so much sadness and grief and loss. I mean, loss of future plans and loss of the next year or two with Karen, that we had great things planned. We've canceled 4 different trips in the last 12 months. And then I had a wave of anger because if you know my wife, it's the last person on the world. She's one of the sweetest people you'll ever meet, way sweeter than me. She eats better than me. I eat ribs. She eats salads. I mean, people make fun of her that she's so healthy. Of all her sisters, of anyone who should have gotten cancer, she's the last one. So I was kind of angry about it. In fact, if you're following, you're probably noticing these stages of grief that are not unusual. You know, I was angry, I was depressed, I was bargaining, I was thinking maybe if we just do this and this, everything will be fine. I was kind of working through all that. The point is, once we step into our grief, it does get messy. And we have to feel things that we might not have wanted to feel or thought we were going to feel. I love Brene Brown, if you know her. She says, sometimes we need to rumble with the truth of our life. And so I was rumbling. And I say all this to say right now, as a parent, it's worth rumbling with the truth of life. You have losses related to your daughter. You probably also have losses related to many other areas of life. And it's really worth the time to write them down somewhere and ask yourself, what is the hardest thing about this whole COVID thing, right? Like, what makes me really sad? You know, what makes me really angry about it? And then if you're really ready to go deep with this, to say, how do I feel about where God's at in all this? You know, if spirituality is important to you, because so often we don't think we can bring this stuff into our relationship with God. And then here's what happens. In 2 years, our faith is gone or cold or like we're just going through the motions and we don't know why. And when I'm working with people, 9 times out of 10, it's because we haven't been willing to rumble with God about how we're really feeling about our life. And you know this, if you're in a relationship with someone, if they're not willing to bring their pain to you and their hurt with you, there's no way you can have an intimate, deep relationship. So I just say that for our own. I know one thing we want for our kids is a good spirituality, however we envision that. And if we don't bring our pain into our spiritual walk, it's going to be, it's not going to work. It's funny, Bishop Ken Untner, for those of you who knew him, he was up in Saginaw. He's one of my favorite people. I was at a little small group with him, and he was telling a story about his sibling was really sick and was probably going to die. And he was arguing with God about it. He was really upset. And so he said he was driving home from the hospital, and he was angry and sad and saying, God, how could you do this? And then finally he said, Jesus, I just don't trust you. And then he was silent for a minute. And then he was like, oh, wait, okay, I trust you. And that was a real breakthrough. But you don't get there without expressing your feelings. So this is hard to do. We tend to do things that work rather than look our pain right in the eye. We have a hard time looking at our pain and then practicing whatever spiritual practice works, whether it's mindfulness, meditation, looking at the cross, really bringing our pain into our spiritual path. But I would suggest to you that it's so important, because if we don't do it, it's going to spill out in other ways. The other gift that comes from grief work is that this gives us a chance oftentimes to heal other pain. Every time we grieve, I know you've probably had this experience, right? It stirs up old pain. Like you go to a funeral of a friend and it reminds you of a parent or a sibling that died, and you start crying for it. I was at a funeral, took my mom to a funeral about 4 months ago, and it was a friend of a friend's husband who had died. But my mom goes to every funeral that of anyone she knows, because that's the way the Irish do it. So I was there, and we were there for several hours. We were sitting, they're talking about this guy, and I didn't know the guy. And as they talked about him, I was thinking, I don't even think I would have spent any time with him if I knew him. Like, he wasn't my kind of guy. But as I was at the funeral home, I began to cry. And my mom thought I was being so compassionate. She touched me on the shoulder, said, "Oh, Timmy, you're so good." But the truth was, I was thinking about my own grief. So grieving well will really help us. Now, the question is, how do we do this? If when we're doing this work, so we start by saying, what hurts? What are we losing? How does it feel to lose it? What's coming up for me? And I suggest journaling it or talking to someone close about it. Then the question is, what happens if we feel like we're getting stuck? One of the things that can happen to the brain is when we're focused on something negative, when we stay focused over time, our brain can turn that into trauma. And the way this is happening, and if you're talking to someone and they're talking about something painful and they start getting very still and they're looking in one direction and then they're going on and on about it, that might look like grief, but it's really, they're building trauma in their brain. So the key is we have to be able to move and breathe. And so something as simple as, while you're grieving and talking about your pain, let your eyes move from the right and to the left. You can do something that's called bilateral stimulation, which is simply you cross your arms like this and just kind of go back and forth like this while you're talking about what really hurts about this is, I'm really going to miss not having that baccalaureate mass. I've been looking forward to that for a long time. It sounds silly, but you'll notice that helps the brain to process and move through the stages of grief and move eventually to a place where it will have some meaning. The other thing you can do is notice your breathing. If you're grieving, talking about your grief work, our breath oftentimes gets shallow. it can be really helpful to pay attention and breathe a little deeply. One of my favorite areas of breath work, and you can practice this now, and it will be especially effective if your daughter's in the same room as you and she doesn't know what you're doing on this webinar. It'll make her wonder what's going on. It's called bellows breath, and it looks like this. You put your fists like this and you hold them close, and then you inhale when you go up like this, and then you exhale when you pull down like this. And then you do about 15 of them in a row. So it looks something like this. And then you do 15 and then pause, maybe 15 more. Here's the key. That will help kind of scramble the circuits of your mind and help you to think better so that you can process your grief better. The whole point is to look our pain in the eye, but don't get overwhelmed by it. That's the first thing. The second thing we said we want to do is we want to take action, be empowered. We want to move with our grief. We don't just want to sit with it and kind of get into this passive kind of feeling victimized by COVID. So how do we do that? Well, there's two main things we do. The first thing we have to do is realize how much freedom we have to focus our mind. You've probably heard this, but at any given time, there are more than as many as 50,000 bits of information bombarding our brain. And by that, I mean everything from sensations from the body, our senses, our thought life. Scientists tell you there's as many as 50,000 at sometimes, but the brain can only process fewer than 50 per second. And so because of that, we are constantly making choices about what we look at and what we don't look at. And one of the ways that we can both help ourselves, but here's the key thing, it also really can help us as parents. This is one of the grand, maybe manipulative, but probably not, more loving ways to coach our kids is to help them understand how powerful it is to embrace the freedom to choose what you're going to look at. You've probably heard the story of Viktor Frankl when he got to the concentration camp, and he walks into these cabins where all these men are dying and they're getting a very small piece of bread every day. Some men are taking that piece of bread and seeing it as an opportunity to bless other people. And so they're walking through the cabin looking for someone who feels sicker than them, that they sharing their bread with other men. And that was revolutionary for Viktor Frankl. He said, holy smokes, we have the power to choose what to focus on and make it whatever we want it to be. And there's really a lot of truth in that. So a way to think about this from the brain's perspective, and this has really struck me with the couples I'm working with and the pastors I'm working with, is there's a part of our brain called the limbic system. For those of you who like science, this is for you. For those of you who don't, take a sip of your glass of wine and come back in 30 seconds. The limbic system is the very center part of the brain, and it has two main jobs. The first job is attachment and love. So when your daughter falls in love with somebody and begins acting irrational, if you took a scan of her brain, you would see that the limbic system is on fire and it's changing the chemistry of the whole darn thing. And what she says doesn't make sense, and we know that because we've all been through it, hopefully. The other thing the limbic system does is it scans for threat. And so if ever you find yourself on edge or like impatient or snappy with people, odds are good that's because your limbic system senses there's a threat in the environment and you have to be ready to fight it because that's where rage comes from. That's where so it's kind of a trick God played on our brain that those two opposite events happen in the same part of the brain. Here's why I share that. Right now, our brain is being triggered for threat over and over and over. Every time you look at your finances, every time you look at your calendar, every time you say, is there going to be a baccalaureate mass? Is there going to be a commencement? Every time in my office, I look out at downtown Plymouth, there's no one there. I know all these store owners. I'm wondering how they're doing. I'm wondering if all these businesses are coming back. It feels like a threat. And because of that, our limbic system activates threat. So now you're in threat, and then you go, you leave your office and you come down and see your family, you're going to be in threat mode, and it's going to make it harder to love. So because of that, we have to find a way to focus on love. We have to intentionally focus on positivity and love. And that's the second thing we have to do. We have to choose ways to keep activating our brain. And the thing we call that is cognitive priming. And so cognitive priming is, I think, one of the grand parenting techniques that will change everything in your house once you know how to use this appropriately. I'm laughing because it's kind of manipulative, but it's manipulation for love, which I always think is worthwhile. So here's a little exercise. You've probably done it, but go ahead and you can do it one last time or just another time with me. Wherever you are in your room, you can just try this. You can look around the room you're in and just for 7 seconds, count all the blue things that you have in that room. So go ahead on your mark, get set, go. Look around, 7 seconds, blue things. What's blue? Count how many there are. And then pause and let your eyes close. And with your eyes closed, remember how many brown things you just saw. And count those with your eyes closed, even if it's just a rough estimate. And then you can go ahead and let your eyes open and look around and see if you missed any brown things. Odds are good, if you're like every human I've ever done that exercise with in real time in an auditorium, you would be amazed how many brown things you missed. And the question is, why did you miss them? You missed them because you weren't looking for them. Because remember that problem with the brain, we can only process fewer than 50 things a second. And yet you're getting bombarded with 20 to 50,000 bits of information. So how does that work right now with grief? What it means with grief is we do the one thing of face our pain, feel it, write about it, look it in the eye, breathe with it, tap with it, talk about it. Then the other part is choosing where we send our attention, because the problem with grief, we get caught up in it when we keep sending our attention back to the grief, and we have to send our attention to something else. So what else do we send our attention to? We have to send our attention to things like gratitude, things that we are grateful for. I was talking to 2 missionaries I work with who are overseas right now, and they're going through an unbelievably difficult time where they are, just because they don't have the resources we have. They're a married couple that are doing missions work. And they said one of the ways they're getting through is every meal they start with, they say in real time, right now, present moment, what are you grateful for? And their kids, and they go around and talk about things that they're grateful for. I think that would be an amazing practice that you could use during this season of COVID, which would then carry over once the season is over. It will be a game changer because our brain is very open to learning new things and with all this novelty. Another way to learn gratitude, if you want to be really good at it, is every morning to write 3 things you're grateful for and try not to repeat anything. So this is a well-established practice. Every morning, 3 things. One of the 3 should be something you can look at, something within your view. Make it an ongoing list. And then eventually you can read that list into a voice memo. So I know for me, I have about a 7-minute list of things I'm grateful for. So many mornings I come downstairs, especially if I'm feeling kind of frustrated. It's a Monday morning. I don't want to, I just don't want to do it anymore. I turn that on, I hit play, and while I'm making my smoothie and coffee in the morning, I just listen to all the things that I've identified over the years that I've been grateful for. And it's like bathing your brain in positivity, and that primes our brain. And when our brain is primed, then we're more likely to see that which we were just thinking about. So when you take 5, 6, 7 minutes in the morning thinking about gratitude, throughout your day, you're going to see things you're grateful for, even at a time like this, So I'd also say this, sometimes, gratitude is great, pointing out the positive. There's also even more subtle ways to get our kids to focus on the good stuff. And so one of the ways to think about that is to ask yourself, what questions do I find myself asking my teens or my kids? You could ask questions like, did you get your work done? Even questions like, how are you feeling? I mean, those are all great questions. But you could also ask questions like, I wonder how this could make us better people. Or like, I wonder if you're noticing what we're learning. You think we're learning anything through this? Like one of the things, for example, I learned over last summer that I shared with my kids is, of all the things I grieved from leaving Grace and with my wife being really sick, is one of the big thig I was grieving from leaving Grace was I had a lot of status there. And the truth is my ego got pumped up there. People said all kinds of things that were, not quite, they're not fully true. People considered me the go-to guy. People would walk in and say, I've been to 3 other therapists, but everyone said, I got to talk to you. And my ego would just expand. So then I left that job, and now I'm just have a very simple practice. I don't get any of that. But you know what? As I saw that and realized I was missing that and allowed myself to grieve that, it's so much more freedom to not have to live up to that stuff, or not to need people to like me, or not to be achieving. Like those kinds of false security programs get to go away. So the point is, we can notice that in ourselves. We can ask questions about that with our kids and begin to see what good things are coming out of this pain. Now remember, and by this is by way of summary for these 2 things, then I have one other comment and then we'll stop. we have to be doing both. We have to be looking at our pain right in the eye, and then we have to come and be action oriented and empowering and grateful, really focused on gratitude, sending our attention to things that are going to bring joy and remind us that our life is good. Interesting study about that. You may have heard this. It's a now famous study where they studied 19 people who had been paralyzed, and then they studied 26 people who had won the lotto, and they looked at their happiness levels over time. And what they found was 6 months after the event, for both groups, their happiness levels returned to a baseline. So as happy as the people who were either paralyzed or won the lotto were before, they got back to that same level after. It's very difficult to change our level of happiness. There's one practice that has a lot of promise, and that is a gratitude practice. So my belief is, as we go through this forest fire of this pandemic, if we can get good at gratitude in the middle of it, we will really change our brains, and we can really up our happiness level when we come through on the other side. So we're saying these are the two things we have to do at the same time. If I could just say one last thing, and that is about what our role as parents. I think it's important that we do our grief work. We do it apart from our teens. So we're not really sharing with our teens all the stuff we're grieving unless we are pretty sure it's going to help them, because otherwise they'll absorb that from us, right? So be doing it with other adults or with your partner or whatever. And then the question is, how can we be parents? As parents, how can we bring parents? And I would say this is just a final kind of closing comment. And that is, I think what our kids need from us is wisdom. And part of that is knowing how to grieve and knowing how to focus on the positive. But the other part of that is just knowing that tough things happen, but life goes through this pattern, and it goes life and then death and then resurrection. And that's kind of the music that is always playing in life. And that's why we don't have to be afraid of death. That's kind of why the old Catholic thing is we always have a crucifix in every room, because we remind ourselves that kind of looks gross on the outside, but the truth is life flows through death. That's just the way it works. So one way to embrace that and become kind of an elder in your community, in your family, is part of your gratitude list to write down memories you have. You could start tonight. Sorry if you're in recovery, I don't mean to make this hard, but if you're not, to pour a glass of wine and sit down with an adult friend and talk about one or two stories where you really thought life was over, whether it was a breakup of a key relationship or a divorce or a lost job or not getting a job or not getting into the school you got into, and then really take time and say, and how did that story get redeemed? On my gratitude list, I started doing this. I call these resurrection stories, like all the deaths I've had, breakups and bad school things, and thought I was going to go mentally ill when I had a really rough time in college. And then I wrote about what came of that and even what good has come of it. And I put them all on a list. And when I read those one after another, it really gives me the confidence to know that I know resurrection's coming from this death. I know this pandemic is bad, but we're going to get through it. And I think our kids need that. And you might even share one or two of those stories with them if you think it would be appropriate. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has a great poem that I came across recently. And in this, it's you may be familiar with it. It's Morituri Solitamus is the name of it in Latin. But he says, as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars, invisible by day. And his point is, the older we get, the more nights we've been to, the more we can see things in our older age, in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, that young people can't see. We know about the stars, even though you can't see them. And so that allows us to be able to share that wisdom with our kids. So last thing is, one of my favorite quotes is from Lord of the Rings. I love Lord of the Rings. And I don't know if you remember the scene when Frodo says to Gandalf, when they're in the middle of this darkness and suffering and evil, and the men of Middle Earth are about to die, he says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. To which Gandalf replies, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And I sort of think that's where we are at. And when we're willing to grieve well and focus on being empowering and positive and gratitude focused, is that we get to decide what we're going to do with this. because we've been put in a very novel situation as parents in the middle of a pandemic. We can't ask our parents. There's no books. We joked about this with the team. There's no books on our shelves, but we get a chance to do what we can as elders, as leaders, to be a blessing to our kids and be a blessing to the community. So that's my hope, that we can do this good grief work and we can be people of wisdom and take our place as elders in the community and be a blessing. So with that, I think I'll pause, and I don't know if there are any questions or if there's anything you want me to add to, or
Yeah, we did have one question come through,
mhm.
and that is, should we be advising our daughters to grieve with the same methods as you're suggesting for us to use?
Sure. I mean, I think you could do it in a very organic way, right? To be asking them, what are you noticing? Like, and you could ask those on both sides, right? You could say, so what is the thing? What is the hardest thing for you today? What are you noticing today is really hard for you about the whole pandemic thing? What do you think is hard for your friends? That might be an easier way for them to get at what's hard for them. The other thing, if parents also have younger kids, I'm a big fan of getting kids to draw. And the truth is, adults who've worked with me know, I give people pads of paper, and I would give you a pad of paper and I would say, draw a picture now of what's going on. If you could do it in a way that's playful. I mean, I know most teens are going to not want to do that, but if they'd be willing to, if a family has younger kids, you could say, let's all draw a picture of the pandemic and how we're doing, just wide open, and find that way to get feelings out. You could ask your teen, is there music that's helping you right now get through this? You could ask, are there people you're worried about? Are there people you think we should be helping? Is there someone we should come alongside, or should we write a check to someone? Anything that helps get at how they're experiencing the pain for themselves, their friends, or the world, I think is wonderful. Because it's kind of the elephant in the room, right? But it's hard to talk about directly.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that came through is sort of more specific to our seniors. Can you suggest ways to help seniors with closure at home, since so many closure events have been canceled? Senior year ended so abruptly for them, and the usual ways they exit high school aren't available.
Right. So this is the challenge. How do you create rituals? And yes, and I would love if there are other parents listening that have ideas. Now would be a good time to put them into you'll write that down right now, and we'll integrate that, and you guys can read that. But I've heard some great things people have done, and I know my wife finished her master's this spring, and so we couldn't wait to go to commencement at Loyola in Chicago and have her walk, and she's not going to be able to. So when it's all said and done and she graduates, we want to come up with a thing that will include a cap and gown, will include blaring the music that we would have heard at commencement, and we'll include a nice dinner. I think you could do it with artwork, right? Here's what I would say. How do you create a ritual that is something sort of like what your family would do, that would involve all your senses? So music, sounds, physical, like dress, like to get dressed up, to make it special, to go to a certain place, maybe to take pictures where you would have taken pictures. I think that kind of stuff would be very helpful. And I know you've done some of that, right? At Mercy, you've found ways to do that, and you're still looking for ways to do that. So I don't know if you guys have other thoughts about how to do that.
I think we've seen some of the similar things, commencement where you're walking across your front porch, writing letters to say goodbye to teachers. We just had a question come in, so this is kind of the opposite. But I think finding those things that you can do as a family to just celebrate those moments, like you said. On the flip side of that, we have a question that just came in. This person's senior is not interested in participating in any sort of send-off. They didn't want to go to the event last Friday in the parking lot. They're not interested in going to graduation. What advice do you have for that parent to help them navigate that space with their teen?
Yeah, boy. And you really have to take a deep breath. It might help to go, do a little reading online about the stages of grief that people go through. And, people go through denial and then anger and sometimes bargaining, depression. And I think part of this, and that's what makes this so epic and so unprecedented, is you know, if someone's really in a place of depression or a place of denial or anger, I don't know where any of that's coming from. It might mean that, you know, she misses out on some of that because she's just not in a place. Now, personally, I would say you'd want to encourage her to be a part of anything that is created on the outside. And maybe this would be a reason to, however you do this. I know with my daughter, we just went and got a carry out latte at our favorite coffee place because they reopened. So we were able to get our coffee and go for a walk and talk about what it was like for her. Because a daughter in that situation might just need to process this. You know, she might need to work it through. And maybe at the end of the day, you make a standing offer that we still want to celebrate this with you at some point. Because it's important to mark these events in life. It really is important. And I would do everything short of forcing her. That's my take. But again, I'm guessing you guys probably have some thoughts about that. That would be really helpful.
Well, I was just thinking, Tim, that, you know, how you were just answering that question speaks to the facing of the grief. So if you've already modeled for your daughter that you're going to face this grief head on and show, you know, some of this is hard for me too, and I'm going to face it. Here's how we're going to face this as a family and show up for these things, or, you know, go through with this new ritual that we've created. I think you can just use that language too to help them understand that that's why we're going to do this, even though it's.
Yes. Yep. Yes.
That was
because go ahead.
I was going to say, one of our parents just said that they had to encourage their student to participate without the forcing. And the student was resistant because it was going to remind them of all the things they were missing.
Yeah.
Like, here
beautiful.
is a substitute kind of thing. But when they got to the event, to the parade, it was much better than the daughter had expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is really, it's a time then to try and summon our inner Gandalf or whatever to find a creative way to encourage and entice, because we know that it is important for our kids to have some of these experiences, right? And to normalize that for them. That makes sense, that it's part of what you might be resisting is feeling that it's going to feel uncomfortable. It might feel awkward. It might feel painful. It might be flat out sad. Yeah, for sure. But better to feel it now.
So what happens to that student then? Like, let's say that the student is resistant to do these things. And we know, we make the choices that are best for us in the time that we're in. And they're never perfect, right? Because they're only perfect when we have hindsight on them.
Yes, right.
So for this student in this situation, or any of our other students that are out there that are not trying things or not doing things because they're afraid of the grief, or they're not ready to feel it in that way, 4 months from now, 2 months from now, a week and a half from now becomes a different level of grief. So how do we work through those roller coasters of, now I've missed out on something and I had the opportunity to do it. So now I have two griefs on top of the one grief.
Yeah, right. And so I think it's important to come back personally. And I think it's important to come back to this place of being gentle with ourselves and to communicate that with our daughters. We got to be super gentle with ourselves. When we have these places that feel like resistant or hurt or those parts of us need more love, not less love. They don't need more discipline. They need compassion and love. So, and again, isn't that a great life lesson that if in August they're getting ready to go off to college or start online college and they're like, wow, I feel like I missed out on all that. I regret it so much. I think to be able to have a dialogue with them and let them feel that, and it's totally understandable that you didn't want to go through it. It's totally makes sense. Our brains weren't prepared for a pandemic. We didn't have any ways. Mom and dad weren't prepared for it. We didn't know how to coach you through it. I think we have this assumption that there's one way to get it right. And I like what you were saying there, Holly, like we can't have the assumption that there's one way to get it right. We do our best in the moment. And then if we make mistakes, we learn a ton. And in some ways, those girls that make the mistakes and don't go and then regret it, they're probably going to have a higher wisdom factor because of the pain, because it's going to remind them, don't miss out on that again. So yeah, but I think for parents, just lots of mercy for ourselves, lots of grace for ourselves that, this isn't in the parenting books. All we can do is take our best shot. And if people aren't ready, you can't force them. It's not going to work.
How do we backstep sometimes as parents? So like, you know, we talk about not putting our grief on our students. And I'm sure there have been times during this that I have put some of my grief on my own child. So how do we walk back from that? Or how do we enter in that conversation again, knowing that, you know, the perception could have been, well, yeah, you wanted to talk about you, or whatever it might have been.
Yeah. Well, I'll do my best to empathize. I mean, I've never had that experience of letting my issues spill out with my kids, but you know, I guess if that happens to lesser parents than me, then wow. Yeah. Here's my take on that. This is a very personal take on that. Thinking of my own parenting with my own 3 kids, because that has happened. I've also, you know, lost my temper, said things I shouldn't have, told them something I shouldn't have about someone. And then I would take the time to be thoughtful about, how do I get this right? Like, what does it look like to recover from this? To make sure that, to check my intentions, that I'm not just using this as another chance to talk about me. You know, if I need to talk about me, I should go talk with my adult friends. But if I'm going to make this a reparative, reconciling move, to very briefly look them in the eye and say, I've not always handled my grief with this pandemic well. One way that I didn't was I dumped some of it on you, and that's not your job. My job is to manage this and then help you manage yours. That's my job as a mom or a dad. So, hey, hon, I regret that I did that. I know it was probably uncomfortable for you, and then let it go. Right? Because it's easy to make it even worse when it becomes another spilling of our guts with our kid, which is the last thing they need, because they're on full with their own life right now. So I think that's a great question. Like, how do you recover and think thoughtfully? Yeah.
Tim, we did have one very caring Mercy community member who wanted to know how your wife is currently doing.
Oh yeah, and we're fine. I didn't mean to say that to you. You feel bad for me now. But thank you for saying that. And we're doing great. It was, you know, that was so out of the blue that at the time last year, it was like knocked me off my horse kind of thing. But you know, we're grateful. We're right here near University of Michigan, which we're super grateful for. As a Notre Dame fan, I've never said that before, but now I do. That we're so close to U of M. Great care. She's going to be great. She's going to be fine. You know, she still has some things. You know, her body. It was a rough year, so it'll be a while before she feels like herself again. But she's really on the right track. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. And hopefully I didn't just overshare with you so that you would feel bad for me. That wasn't my intent. I wanted to share with you how terrible I was at grief. So thanks for asking.
It looks like we may have taken care of all of our questions. Is there anything else you think that we should have asked about that we didn't ask about?
I love those. I love those questions. I think the big question for me that I just want to maybe take one more moment with is there anything else we could be doing? Because one of the big things that, you know, we were talking about as we were preparing for this webinar was an awareness of all these rituals that will not happen the way the young women are used to them happening. And that can be very difficult. It can feel like something's unfinished. And I guess if there's any other comments or questions about other ways that can be done, I guess I'd want to encourage and empower parents that to be praying about that, to be thinking about that, brainstorming, and if ideas come up, suggest them to other parents, and that could turn out to be. And then also, you know, there might be a place, who knows, next year, you know, we may need some of these human rituals next summer, you know, maybe even a mini reunion or something for this year's class. Maybe space will need to be created for that. Who knows? We should, but I think we should be open to that, knowing that, you know, this is epic and we don't have any manuals. There's no playbook. So we have to make it up as we go. So that'd be, yeah.
We'll give it just one more second to see if anything pops up. I think we might have gotten all of our questions.
Okay, great.
We got a thank you. Fantastic.
Great. Oh, I see.
As parents, I want to remind you that when we close out this Zoom, you're going to see a survey. So if you could help us out by just, you know, anything you see, just go ahead and fill out the survey. When Dr. Hogan, when we're finished, he's going to share a list of resources with us as well. And so when we send out the link to this video webinar, we will also have a list of resources for you. So you'll actually have more information. And please, keep us apprised of anything that you might need. We continue to pray for all of you. And so we thank you for your time. Dr. Hogan, thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really is a privilege. I love your mission. I love what you guys are doing. And I really respect the parents who make the investment to be a part of it. So
thank you.
Great.
Be well.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Yep. All right.